The Carolina Panthers head into 2024 with not a lot of expectations. So in today's video, I want to talk about the Carolina Panthers and why I personally believe they may be a tad bit underrated. So as I mentioned, I think the Panthers are a tad bit underrated. Now hold your horses, I don't think they're going to make the playoffs. With that all said though, I think they're better than the worst team in the NFL like many people have them being. So in today's video, we're going to be going over 4 reasons why the Carolina Panthers are underrated. And of course, if you agree or disagree, let us know in the comment section below. And last thing here, around 90% of you guys who watch my content are not subscribed. So if you do enjoy the content and if you find yourself coming back for more content, please consider hitting the like and subscribe button. Let's hop into the list though. Starting off at number 4, we will be discussing the overall changes that happened with the Carolina Panthers, which is my number 1 reason as to why this team is better than they were last year and in my opinion underrated. When you look at the entire offense surrounding Bryce Young, you will find a lot of differences from last year. Obviously, the quarterback room is basically the same. You did add a couple of backup quarterbacks, but you still have Andy Dalton, you still have Bryce Young. Your guys are still there. In the running back room, you brought in Jonathan Brooks, who I don't know how healthy he is as of today, but I would not be shocked if he does not play until like halfway through the year. With that all being said though, I was very high on Jonathan Brooks coming out of college. I had him as my number 1 ranked running back in last year's draft, and had he not torn his ACL, he would have been going in the back end of the first round or the very early second round if he stayed healthy. I think Jonathan Brooks has really good contact balance. I think his speed is underrated. I think he's a very good pass catcher. I think he's a really decent pass blocker. And I think ultimately Jonathan Brooks is probably the best running back in this running back group, especially when healthy. I do think Chuba Hubbard is a decent running back, but I think Jonathan Brooks' potential is a lot higher than Chuba's. Regardless of that though, you do have a decent trio of running backs when healthy with Jonathan Brooks, Chuba Hubbard, and Miles Sanders. I know Miles Sanders was very disappointing last year, but I still think he's a decent running back. Then your receiving core has seen a lot of big time changes, starting off with Deontay Johnson. I know Deontay Johnson has never really transitioned into being the true number 1 receiver for the Pittsburgh Steelers, but I do think for this team, he does have the chance to be the best receiver out there. Deontay is a very good route runner, a very good player with the ball in his hands, and I think for the most part he's probably their best guy at making separation. As long as the hands don't really come back to bite the Panthers in the ass, I think that he should be their best receiver this upcoming season. Then of course you have Adam Thielen, who I know is like 55 years old, but he's still really good as that slot receiver, your third option. He's just a really good veteran who knows what to do. Then you got the rookie Xavier Legette, who I'm interested to see what he's able to do next year. Obviously we know what he did in South Carolina in his last year. He was very productive. He's very good deep down the field. He's got a big body, big frame, big radius to make big time catches. But it's just more of a question of how long is it going to take for him to transition into the NFL style more than it is how good he'll be. Because I do think his play style will allow him to be a very dominant receiver. I just don't know what his true ceiling is quite yet. Behind them, you obviously have Terrace Marshall and Jonathan Mingo. I'm hopeful that Jonathan Mingo can maybe develop into being somewhat of a playmaker for this team next year. In the tight end room, you obviously have Tommy Tremble, but Jatavion Sanders, in my opinion, was a very good pickup for this team. Similar to Jonathan Brooks, I was a lot higher on Jatavion Sanders than a lot of other people were. His draft stock started to fall after the draft combine and after maybe some lackluster pro days, but I still feel like the tape on the field was very solid for Jatavion. Yes, he is maybe the worst run blocker and pass protector in the draft at the tight end position, but I do think that he makes up for it with what he can do with the ball in his hands. He reminds me in some ways of like a Delaney Walker-like guy, somebody who isn't the typical size for the tight end position, maybe a tad bit smaller than what you would like, maybe not as big or as physical as you would like, but somebody who it gets consistently wide open, and when he gets that ball in his hands is a legitimate playmaker. I think Jatavion Sanders works nicely alongside guys like Tommy Tremble and Ian Thomas to sort of be, you know, the pass catching receiving guy, whereas the other guys can do a bit more of everything. I don't know how big Sanders' role is going to be this year, but if he does get a sizable role, I think he'll be very productive. Then you have the offensive line, which I actually think is a pretty solid unit now. At the left tackle position, you obviously have Ike Mekwonu, who maybe took a step back last year, but obviously still has a bunch of talent that I think he needs to tap into. Behind him, you brought in Josh Nijman from the Green Bay Packers, somebody who wasn't great for them, but was a very serviceable tackle throughout his time there. So for him to be your swing swing tackle, I think it's a really good pickup for them. Then you obviously brought in 2 brand new guards with Damian Lewis and Robert Hunt. Robert Hunt being the better of the 2, but Damian Lewis still being a very, very good guard in his own right. Compared to what you had last year, this is a massive, and I mean massive, upgrade for this offense. I do think the run game should be so much better in the interior of the offensive line because of these guys. At center is Austin Corbett, and at right tackle is Taylor Moton. I do think Taylor Moton is a little bit underrated, so I think as it looks for your entire offensive line, assuming that Ike Ekwonu plays like we think he can, then I think Bryce Young actually has a really solid offensive line in front of him. I think that last year's was maybe the worst in the league, but I think now he actually has a kind of a decent one. Then you look at the defense. I know the defense didn't make a whole bunch of moves this offseason. They brought in some guys like Josie Jewell, Jatavion Clowney, Dane Jackson, but that's really all the moves they made. I do think those are some pretty solid moves in their own right. I like the Dane Jackson move a lot, but for the most part, it's the exact same defense, which really isn't that big of an issue because in my opinion, they had to make moves offensively, and I thought the defense wasn't the issue last year. I think for the most part, the defense is mediocre to decent, and perhaps with a good offense could actually be somewhat of like a top 15 unit next year. Assuming that JC Horn is able to stay healthy and that there's other guys who can pick up the slack of what they lost with Brian Burns, then I do believe that this defense should be at least pretty decent next year. So all in all, when we compare this team from what they were last year, it is night and day different, and I do personally believe that this offense is going to take a big time step forward, which is going to allow the defense to take a step forward, which is going to obviously allow the whole team to take a big step forward. But my number 2 reason as to why I think this team is a tad bit underrated is that Bryce Young was drafted number 1 for a reason, yet people kind of forget that he was. Coming out of college, Bryce Young was the guy coming out of Alabama. He was, for most people, the best quarterback in that 2023 draft over the likes of Will Levis, Anthony Richardson, and of course, the biggest name here, CJ Stroud. Yet despite all that, everyone just loves to clown on this guy for no reason, despite the fact that he is uber talented and was just put in a really bad situation in year 1. I don't care who the quarterback was. If you had thrown CJ Stroud on this Panthers team with the playmakers that he had, with the running game that he had, with the offensive line, and with the coaching staff that he had, he probably would not have been that successful. Now, I'm not going to sit up here and tell you guys that Bryce Young is going to be better than CJ Stroud now that Bryce's team is actually pretty decent. But I will say that there was a genuine reason why coming out of college, he was taken number 1 and thought to be the best player in this draft. For context, at Bleacher Report, his positives are listed like this: above average athleticism and explosiveness, flexible mechanics, good accuracy, especially in rhythm, fearless under pressure despite his size, above average decision maker, doesn't force the ball and generally does well to play on time, electric playmaker, and creative mind. His only negatives are really his weight concerns, his height, his processing was a little inconsistent in 2022, and other than that, that was basically it. There was no questions about his arm strength. Their arm strength was pretty good given his size. The only concerns were the height and weight, and it really was not an issue last year for him. For more context, Bleacher Report is actually a bit more of a negative outlook on Bryce Young. He was their quarterback 3 in that year's draft. Despite that, though, he was compared to a downsized Tony Romo. And I know Tony Romo is not going to be a Hall of Famer, but Tony Romo was a damn good quarterback for many, many, many years of his career. And I remember the entire offseason, people were consistently comparing Bryce Young to the likes of like a Drew Brees or a Kyler Murray. And while I don't think he'll ever be as good as Drew Brees, because Drew Brees is arguably a top 10 quarterback all time, but there was good reason as to why people compared him to that. He was very accurate coming out of college. He was a very strong, physical guy in the pocket, good mobility, good scrambler, and the best part about him, he was a good decision maker coming out of college. Again, the only concerns we had for Bryce Young was maybe the upside of what his body can do for him. And now all of a sudden, after one poor year with, as I mentioned earlier, the worst situation around him, now everyone is trying to make all these claims about why Bryce Young sucks as a quarterback. I'm sorry, but his talent is still there. It's not like he lost all his talent in one season. That's just not how this stuff works. He now has a good system around him. He now has a good head coach around him who actually knows how to run an offense. And the team is actually somewhat decent. So I do expect Bryce Young to have a massive year next year. Now, I'm not going to sit up here and tell you guys that Bryce Young is going to be a top 10 quarterback next year, but last year you can make the case that Bryce was the worst quarterback in the NFL, and I don't think that there's a world in which that happens this year. I think Bryce will be somewhere in the top 20, which in my opinion is a good step forward for him as a player. I think he'll probably surpass over 3,000 yards, have over 20 touchdowns, and keep the interceptions pretty low. And if he does that, I would say that's kind of mildly successful. Again, the situation around him is so much better, the head coach is so much better, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, I just really think that Bryce Young is going to be able to step forward and actually be somewhat good next year. But as I mentioned earlier, the third reason as to why I think the Panthers are a tad bit underrated is Dave Canales, because I think he's going to bring this team a bit of some new hope. Dave Canales has been an offensive coordinator for a couple of teams now. He was with the Seattle Seahawks with Geno Smith, and last year he was the offensive coordinator for the Baker Mayfield-led Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And in this offseason, he became a pretty big name in the head coaching market because of what he's been able to do with some pretty, I don't want to say bad quarterbacks, but not great quarterbacks in Baker Mayfield and Geno Smith. He made those guys solid quarterback ones, and for the sake of the Buccaneers, last year they made it to the playoffs and actually won a game behind Baker Mayfield. And now Dave Canales gets his hands on his most talented quarterback in Bryce Young and finally has his chance to mold the team around him to make Bryce Young the best quarterback that he is. I think everything that Dave Canales has done this offseason and everything that he has said this offseason has been on point. You don't need to fix Bryce Young. You just got to make the situation around him better and he's going to succeed. However, if Dave Canales, for whatever reason, has to fix Bryce Young, let's say last year maybe damaged his confidence or damaged his abilities, which I don't think they will, but let's say they did, then Dave Canales is the perfect guy who is around the same age as Bryce Young. He's a very young coach who can speak to him and talk to him and consistently, supply him with confidence and make him the best quarterback that he can be. My personal belief was that the Dave Canales coaching hire was one of the best decisions the Panthers could have made last year. In fact, I would have maybe had him as my head coach one option for the Panthers, given his history and given what the Panthers need. But man, from what you had last year in the coaching staff, which was just really bad. I mean, it was as bad as you can get. So now you have a younger guy who's a little bit more understandable, who can speak to these guys and just can be a genius offensive mind. Like, I think this is such a good hire. Coming in at number 4, and the last reason that I'll talk about as to why I think the Panthers is underrated, is I actually think their schedule is fairly easy. Now, I don't want to say it's easy for the Panthers because the Panthers aren't going to be a great team next year, but after kind of looking through the roster, I think there's approximately like 10 games that I think are somewhat winnable for the Panthers. Now, I'm not going to say they're going to win 10 games because they definitely will not, but I do believe that there are about 10 games where the Panthers have a 50-50 chance of winning. Let's go ahead and look through the schedule. Starting off between weeks 1 and 3, I think these are 3 winnable games for the Panthers. You have the Saints, the Chargers, and the Raiders. I don't think they're going to win all 3 of those games. In fact, I would be absolutely shocked that if they won 3 or even 2 of these games, I think they'll likely lose to the Chargers, probably the Saints, and maybe the Raiders. But I do think that these games are at least winnable for them. Then between weeks 4, 5, and 6, you have a couple of bad matchups against the Bengals, the Bears, and the Falcons. I know they beat the Falcons last year in one game, but the Falcons are a significantly better team. I don't really believe they're going to be able to win any of those 3 games. However, a Caleb Williams-Bryce Young matchup does pose a lot of questions, so let's say Chicago starts off a little slow, maybe the Panthers could win that one. Then after that, in weeks 7, 8, and 9, and 10, you actually have 4 relatively easy matchups against the Washington Commanders, the Denver Broncos, the Saints, and the New York Giants. That is probably your most easy set of games the entire season. The Washington Commanders obviously have a rookie quarterback, so do the Denver Broncos, and the Saints obviously have a lot of question marks, and then the Giants have Daniel Jones, which you're probably going to win that game. Then you have a week 11 bye, which is actually extremely nice because the following week you do have the Kansas City Chiefs, which you're not going to win that one. In fact, you're likely not going to win the next 4 because you have the Chiefs, the Buccaneers, the Philadelphia Eagles, and the Dallas Cowboys. That is probably 0-4, but maybe you could beat the Buccaneers if you get lucky. Then to end your season off, you have the Cardinals, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and the Atlanta Falcons. 3 games that I think are somewhat winnable, especially if the Falcons maybe have already locked up the division. But for the most part, I don't expect them to win a ton of games this year, but I expect them to be able to win some of these winnable games. Again, I think around 8 to 9 to 10 of these games are somewhat winnable for the Carolina Panthers, which in my opinion is a lot better than what it was last year. A lot of people last year were saying that the Panthers were an underrated team before the season. They had Bryce Young, they had a new head coach, they had some interesting pieces, and then obviously they were the worst team in the league last year for good reason. But now I'm back here to kind of jump on the bandwagon of saying the Panthers are somewhat overrated. I've seen many, and I mean many, outlets say the Panthers are either the worst, the second worst, or the third worst team in the league. When in reality, I actually think the Panthers are more in that 25 to 20 range than they are that 32 to 30 range. So with that all said, that's just my opinion on the Carolina Panthers. I don't think they're a good team. Let's just make that abundantly clear. I don't think they're going to win more than maybe 7 games next year. But if they win more than 2, that's better than what they did last year. And I know a lot of people do not have a lot of expectations for this Panthers team, which is, understandable. They were really bad last year for a reason, but I think they're actually somewhat decent next year. But with that all said, let me know your opinion on the Panthers in the comment section below. And if you agree or disagree with anything that I said, again, let us know in the comments. But I hope you guys enjoyed, and I love you guys. Peace.